told me that the patio that we used to keep so white is now gray, things are falling down, it's such a shame. So you will find an almost equally impossible ruined Cuba in the mind of Exile. So you have these two very polar notions of Cuba then and Cuba today. So again, the idea of splitting, that the place of Cuba has split in time and almost on a moral axis, right? So I found that to be very interesting. Mapping memories, another interesting thread that I found in the conversations that I had with the Exiles. So when I started to interview people, the thing that they would do initially is walk me around the map. They would say, in order for you to talk to me and understand what I'm saying, you need to know where I'm talking about. And so everyone that I interviewed took great pains at walking me around the map and pointing out these places that were very significant to them and that had somehow changed or that they had thought about. So one of the things that Castro did, and that people are very angry about, was that he changed some of the street names in Havana. Some of the very poetic street names that existed before the revolution were gone away and replaced with numbers, a very clinical numbering system, right? And the street signs were changed. Also, the provincial boundaries were redrawn. There are more provinces now than there were prior to the revolution, and there's also a special municipality. So Castro messed with the map. And this is a classic technique of dictatorships and of colonizers, to mess with the map, because it symbolically erases the people and their landmarks and disorients them. My friend Jim Tyner, who's a geographer at Kent State, calls it the unmaking of space that happens in revolution. And he quotes Henri Lefebvre, who students may have been tormented with Henri Lefebvre, French urban theorist who had a lot to say about revolution. And Lefebvre said, a revolution that does not produce a new space has not realized its full potential. So what was happening as Castro messed with the geography is that he was producing a new space and erasing those people and their memories that had been there before. So what happened when the Exiles came to Miami? They recreated some of those places. So if you go around Miami with your eyes open, or maybe with an Exile, you'll find some of the landmarks that existed in Havana have been recreated here. Some of the place names have been transferred. Some of those old streets that went away, they're here. Businesses, societies, and clubs, all around Miami, you'll find wonderful examples of things that used to exist in Havana and may not exist there anymore, but now exist here in Miami. I had a wonderful picture of a close-up of the map that is still in my email, but I'll tell you about it. It's called Colegio de Belén. How many of you guys know about Belén School?
I went to.
You went to Belén School, and it's here in Miami, right? That was pretty much transported to Miami. So you find almost a shadow geography in Miami, what has been referred to by some scholars as a palimpsest, which is an artistic kind of, it's a word that comes from art that talks about, back when canvases were expensive, right? An artist would sketch something and then not like it and sketch something over it and maybe paint something and then it didn't like the painting and paint something else over it. So you have these layered images on top of one another. And Miami is sort of a palimpsest. It's a layer upon layer upon layer of things that that existed in Cuba before the revolution and now exist in a selective fashion here. They didn't transfer everything over, right? So this memory is always selective. There's really a haunting of place by the memory of exiles here in Miami, by people and places that no longer exist, which I find really fascinating as a geographer. We talked about that a little bit. But I want to focus on the split selves part of what I found in the interviews. And I'm just going to read that little piece and then I'm going to wrap it up. So split selves, another thing that I noticed when I spoke with exiles, this idea of splitting and doubling, both in the self and in place. Many interviewees recounted detailed alternative futures that were derailed by the Cuban Revolution in 1959. They told of personal trajectories suddenly interrupted and rerouted, expressing a mixture of sadness, curiosity, and nostalgia about el yo que no fui, the person that I could have become but I didn't become. Marriages that didn't occur, children who were not born, careers that had not been pursued. In the interviews, a notion of the splitting of the self through the process of exile emerged, whereby one version of the self remained behind in Cuba, while another lived on in temporary exile in Miami. The person that was lives along dynamically with the place that was, this impossible Cuba of paradise, right? In the active cultivation of exile memory. On the map at the Cuban Nostalgia Festival, exiles were temporarily able to rejoin their split selves and to feel whole again. So I did one interview with 5 women. I think I mentioned that at the beginning. These 5 women, there were 4 women who were in high school and their teacher. And every 10 years, they meet on the map at the Cuban Nostalgia Festival. They all went into exile together and they meet up every 10 years. And it was a particularly raucous interview because all 5 of them were going at once and they're having a good time. But we talked about this idea of the split self that emerged for all of them. The women speculated in great detail about what their lives would have been like had the revolution not happened. The children that they would have had versus the ones that they did have, the people they would have married versus the ones they did marry, and the alternate occupations they would have pursued. The younger women, those women who were high school students at the time, had been in their late teens at the time of the revolution. They were thinking about marriage, they were thinking about starting families. And again, they meet together on the map at the festival to mark every 10-year high school graduation anniversary. And during our interview, they were celebrating their 50th graduation anniversary. They expressed how the map transports them collectively back to 1961, which is when they all left, and their youthful selves, as well as better versions of their current lives. One of them said, with distance, with age, it gets more and more beautiful. The return to youth via the map is a sentiment echoed by another interviewee, Cedia, who was the oldest person that I interviewed. She's in her late 80s. She said the map, quote, makes me feel young with the knowledge that I have now, but the strength that I had then. And Piki noted, on this map, I can find myself again. I lived with my parents in the country club neighborhood of Havana, which is over there, and she showed me where it was, on Estrada Avenue. And my husband lived in El Vedal, another Havana neighborhood. And so really, we relive all of these places in Havana, and I'm just gonna leave it there. I'm not gonna say anymore. And she broke down in tears. Piki's explanation reveals how the map allows the exile to temporarily unite the split pieces of herself and thereby experience a sense of unity, which is particularly important for exiles, as, quote, Jorge Gracia says, the diasporic subject inhabits multiple sites that cannot be reduced to the binary here, aquí, or there, allí. Rather, she is always in a place of transition, wholly belonging neither to here nor there. So I speculate that there's a temporary healing that of the split self through bringing together of here and there in the present moment of practice that arises in the encounter with the other exiles on the floor map. Elena, another person that I interviewed, said, it is as if the map was a little piece of the Cuban soil, un pedacito de la tierra cubana, connecting us to our life through memories of that era, of those years. The moment that the plane or the boat leaves the gate or leaves the dock, and the final goodbyes are waved, often marks the split of the self. And that's something that's been captured a lot in Cuban art and writing, this notion of the leaving. That's so important. Magali, who is a person that I interviewed in this group, vividly recounted the strange sensation of seeing herself left behind in Cuba from the airplane taking her to Miami. She said, you know, when the plane takes off over the sea, I look back towards Havana. I felt like I was dying. I felt like I was leaving myself behind. That broke my heart. Me partió el alma. It split my soul in Spanish. So it's a splitting idea, very, very resonant in what she was saying. Indeed, Cuban American art and literature often reference the point of departure as a traumatic moment of rupture, the source of the divided lives motif that weaves a common thread throughout Cuban American cultural production. Going back to Gustavo Pérez Firmat, who writes a lot about being Cuban American in the US and the split self. He talks about his departure from Cuba as a dream. He recounts it as a dream. Ooh, I thought I had that up there. Oh, well, I don't know how to get it back, so I'm going to read you guys the quote. It was the last quote that I had. So Pérez Firmat writes about the moment of departure and the splitting of the self in a way that I found very compelling and sounding a lot like what Magali told me. As the ferry lurched away from the pier, I looked back to see a small boy waving goodbye to me. I realize that this boy on the dock is me. Somehow in my dream, I'm in two pieces at once. I'm on the dock and I'm waving. From the dock, I can see myself on the ferry getting smaller and smaller until what is left is no bigger than a swallow's flutter. From the ferry, I can see myself on the dock getting smaller and smaller until what is left is no bigger than a swallow's flutter. I feel the loss of that Cuban boy inside of me. He's my phantom limb. I need to bring him out of the shadows. I need to grow him back. Our own Uva de Aragon, some of you may know her, has written a novel called Memorias del Silencio, and she uses the motif of twins that were split. One stayed in Cuba, one came to Miami, and the novel is in part about trying to unite these split selves that she uses the twin to talk about. So what I'm thinking about with the split self part of the interviews that I did is that the map at the Cuban Nostalgia Festival allows a permissible form of return and a temporary healing of the split of exile. Maida said, "It's like going back in time to the place where I actually walked, because I've walked these streets and gone to these places. It's part of who I am. I'm coming home to myself." So by way of conclusion, and this is where I need to do some work still, because I need to tighten this up a little bit. This is all good and fine, but one of the things that I'm known for is insisting that case studies have to speak to larger issues. Case studies are all wonderful, good and fine, but what does this case study tell us that can inform larger discussions? So what can I take away from this work that I'm doing with Cuban exiles that might inform geographic work on displaced peoples, or just in general about what we understand about home and place and self? Well, the things that I think we can take away that transcend the case study involve the importance of emotion and affect and memory, which is something, at least in the geographic study of mobility, is often stripped out. It's not scientific. We look at distances, we look at numbers coming through the gates, we look at all sorts of empirical things that we can measure, but we don't talk about people's emotions and their memories, and that's a really important part of mobility that needs to be put back into how we study movement and migration and mobility. Another takeaway for me is the fragility of home. Exiles very distinctly have been desterrados. They've been taken out of the land, out of their homeland, but home itself is a fragile notion. Both houses and homelands are fragile. They're vulnerable to violence, they're vulnerable to natural disaster, or just even the happiest of homes to crumbling away over the passage of time and the death of the people who made that home what it was. So home is perhaps best thought of, I think, as an aspirational horizon, an idea towards which we strive but never reach, rather than a static place on the map. And home is also a place. David Harvey, who's a geographer, has said that places are subject to perpetual perishing. There's an always crumbling aspect to places. And so that the identities associated with those places are never really stable. They're always changing, and perhaps that what the study of exiles does is throw that into some pretty sharp relief. Just in terms of the case study, back to that, to end with that, I noted on one of the early slides that I showed you that the floor map by 2015 had been reduced to, my eyeballing it, from 30 feet to 50 feet, it's gone to about 20 by 30 at this point. So that map is getting smaller. It's a series of panels that are put together on the floor. And so some of those panels have been taken away and causing people to be very upset because some of those neighborhoods that they went to visit had been taken away. More and more floor space in the expo has been given over to healthcare and funeral homes. So it tells you space reflecting and interacting with society the way that it does. It's telling us an uncomfortable reality that these exiles are aging and they're dying off. And so this case study that I've done in some short measure is going to become irrelevant through the deaths of the people who are participating in it. But also through the political things that are happening with Cuba. I mean, during the course of writing this paper over 2015, we're having discussions of normalization of political and perhaps economic relationships with Cuba. So this whole state of exceptionalism that Cuba and Cubans have existed in for more than 50 years is something that is no longer going to be there. And so case studies like this can't be done on these exiles in the future. So again, I think it's important to ask, well, what can we learn more generally from this study of exiles? I need to tie that up a little bit more tightly, but that's where I am now, and I thank you all for listening. It's been a real pleasure to share this work with you. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What can I do to improve this? What have I missed? What did this make you think of? I'm just curious to hear.